Join me, would you, in the book of Proverbs. We're considering practical themes addressed in the book of Proverbs on how to become wise. So we began considering last week the subject of discipline, looking at how God disciplines us. And now this morning we're going to look at how God has instructed us to wisely discipline children. Now, those of you who have children, immediately applicable. To those of you who aren't currently raising children, where you have opportunity to spur on, to encourage, to help parents around you parent, that's useful. Those of you who someday aspire to have children, this is useful. Those of you who feel like, been there, done that, too late anyway. Don't say anything too insightful. It might make me feel bad or might point out a mistake I made. Let's just get on to lunch. You can make application to know that the model of discipline that parents are supposed to have with their children is after God's discipline of us. And the primary thing I want to convince us of this morning is that God's discipline and the discipline of a parent to a child is an evidence and an act of love. So God's discipline of you, if you are his child, is in love. It doesn't feel that way. I think it's why the scriptures tell us it's in love, because we wouldn't come to that conclusion on our own. So if you're not currently being disciplined by God, you have been in the past, or you will be in the future, probably pretty consistently, because God is a good father. This will help you or invite you to make connections to maybe some of the discipline in your own life that's hard to receive as loving, to actually see it as loving and purposeful and effective. So discipline, as we began to consider last week, discipline in the Bible, it's training. In English, we think of only corrective discipline, primarily when we use the word discipline. But it's important to know in the Bible, as is true in the book of Proverbs, discipline is formative and corrective. So the word primarily translated in the book of Proverbs, discipline, actually is in there 30 times. 20 times, it's interpreted a version of instruction, counsel, teaching. The other third, it's translated discipline, and it has corrective discipline in mind. So in Proverbs 6:23, both of these ideas are utilized. First formative and then corrective. So 6:23 says, "For the commandment is a lamp and the teaching is a light, and the reproofs of discipline are the way of life." So there's formative discipline and corrective discipline. I don't think anybody needs persuaded that parents need to do formative discipline for their kids. It's all the proactive training, coaching, counseling, helping, informing, directing, leading, guiding. Nobody needs convinced that it's absolutely necessary for a parent to do. The Bible makes that plain. Experience makes that plain. So we're not going to spend any time laboring on that point. We all agree. Children need formative discipline. What we're going to talk about this morning is corrective discipline. So you have to hear this in context, because what we're going to talk almost entirely about is corrective discipline. But corrective discipline is a smaller part of the whole that is discipline. So if the front of the stage here is discipline, the way the Bible talks of it, most of it, let's call it 2/3. That's how it is in Proverbs. Let's call 2/3 of it formative discipline. That's not what we're talking about this morning. We're going to talk about the last third, called corrective discipline. So everything that we're going to consider and see in Proverbs about corrective discipline has to find its place in the larger whole that includes formative discipline. Proverbs 3:11 and 12, with corrective discipline in mind. "My son, do not despise Yahweh, the I Am, the Lord's discipline, or be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father, the son in whom he delights." The first point I want to make this morning is that corrective discipline is an evidence and an act of love. And then we're going to consider within corrective discipline two primary categories of discipline, the rod and the staff. First, corrective discipline, especially when we're considering God towards us. It's the model. for how we as parents discipline our kids. It's an act and it's an evidence of love. Proverbs 19:18, discipline your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on putting him to death. Raise your hand if you've raised a child and your aspiration is to put them to death. God forbid, no. Okay, maybe in slight moments, but you didn't really mean it. Not as much as you thought at the time. We desire life for our children. Well, so then discipline them. Remember, this is corrective discipline. There is hope for them. Because there is hope, correct them. Discipline your son, and he will give you rest. He will give delight to your heart. It does not feel like discipline is love, but God makes it abundantly clear that it is. Not only is it an act of love, it's supposed to be an evidence of love. Meaning, where there is love for a child, love is a commitment to act in the highest good of another. Where that exists, then an evidence of that and an act of that is discipline. Now, it is not true that every parent loves their child. That should be true. I wish that were true. There are unfortunately many children in our world that do not have parents who act consistently in their well-being. That's first and primary. God forbid we would ever somehow have in mind that I discipline, and just because I discipline, therefore that is love. Maybe not. Let's not assume what is most foundational, that a parent has a commitment to a child to their highest good. This is how God interacts with us. This is the foundation of all God's parenting of all of his children, that there's a commitment to act in the highest good. When that exists, well, then discipline is a way that that love gets expressed. It's evidence and an act of love, largely in part because of what the Proverbs reveal about the very nature of the opposite of wisdom. So there's Proverbs and 22 that go together. There are sections of Proverbs that get coupled together, and some I can see the pattern in. Chapter 22 is one of them. These Proverbs form a bookend. Train up a child in the way that he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. We must train children for wisdom because foolishness infects the heart from birth. From the very beginning, children are born with the infection of folly, foolishness, sin. The Bible attests to this in many places. Our world, the worst of our world, when it comes to children and training children, has the very core of children wrong. There are parts of our culture that would say to you, a child is pure, a child is innocent, a child is perfect. Then, therefore, the responsibility of the authorities around them and over them is to only nurture, affirm that little seed that is pure. And then the responsibility of the authorities is to understand every nuance of that perfect, innocent, pure seed, to let it grow in whatever shape or form it is. So that little child is told things like, just follow your heart, or you're the one who knows best who you are. Foolishness that damages children, that is not consistent with reality. Children are not born innocent and pure. They are born instead with the infection of sin inherited from Adam and Eve. Folly, foolishness, the opposite. It's bound up in the heart of a child. But there is hope for them. If you have in your mind that your child is born morally neutral, or even worse, like aligned with God, not the case, says God, but born in a position already contrary to God, on a pathway away from God, leading further and further away. Discipline, even corrective discipline, it's a rescue mission. It's a rescue mission to help a child experience the consequences and the pain of their own indwelling fallen condition so that they can be delivered from it and rescued from it. Isn't this what God has done for all of his children? This is what a parent does for their child. This is one of the primary reasons why even corrective discipline is love. Train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old. When he is old, when she is old, they will not depart from it. This is not a promise that says if you raise your child in a certain way, you will be guaranteed to get this result. It's normally the case. You raise a child in a home to love a certain football team. Let's say, in my case, a particular football team that will fill your fingers with Super Bowl rings. When you are raised to love that football team and to love football and to love sports, generally it sticks. A child is raised in a home that loves the arts, values the arts, visits museums, appreciates the finer things of culture. I didn't get raised in that family. I grew up in the barbaric Neanderthal sports family. The arts family, those kids tend to stick with it. This is a truism. The Proverbs make it clear. This is clarity, maybe a relief to some of you. If you imagine as a parent, your job as a parent is to ensure that your child chooses to follow Jesus someday, you don't have the authority to do that. And I don't believe that's what God will hold us accountable for as parents. Our responsibility is to train them, to make it normative, to know how to follow Jesus. But the Proverbs testify, there are many in the Proverbs that they don't listen to the teaching of the parents. They reject sound counsel. They reject God's move to discipline and then correct them. So you can be raised very well and choose to go a different way. So if you're a parent that has great guilt, you think you did everything you could to raise your child in Christ, and your child rejects, I don't think you have to carry guilt for that. Sure, remorse, sorrow, be motivated to pray, but not guilt. And if you imagine as a younger parent that your number one job, that you're going to stand before God someday and he's going to say, did you make that little kid a Christian? I don't think that's the case. Bound up in the heart of a child is the very condition, the very disease, the very infection that moves them away from God, that tells them they are God, they are the supreme authority, they are the one who is right. If you leave that in a child when they're young, it only gets harder and harder to rescue them from that when they age. It's bound up in there. We rescue them from it. The author of Hebrews, considering these truths in Proverbs, quotes Proverbs. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. This is true of us as children of God. This is true of our children who are being parented. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons and daughters. For what child is there? What son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Far worse for a child to grow up without formative and corrective discipline. Far worse by a long shot. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, our parents did, as it seemed best to them. And sometimes, frankly, it probably wasn't so good. But God disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later on, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. There are limitations to our parental correction, and there are barriers to it, and it's difficult. Our culture puts against us a lie that somehow children are innocent, pure, they don't need discipline. Or so that to discipline them, to correct them, it's mean, it's harsh, it's outdated. There are countries in Europe where corporal correction, corporal discipline is outlawed. I anticipate in my own lifetime, we will have states in our own union that outlaw corporal discipline. Our world tells us they don't need it. Then to give it is harsh and mean. We have our own limitations. Now, some of these are close to home. Some of you as parents, you were abused or mistreated as a child physically. So the thought of laying a hand on your own child, though you would never do it with the same abusive intent, you just can't bring yourself to do it. Or you're afraid of your own anger that you would misuse it. Or you're afraid, you hear some really smart doctor say something like, corporal discipline will make your child violent and angry. There is headwind against believing what God has said and practicing what God has said, but it is loving. It's God's will. It's a child's need. So the Apostle Paul picks up what Proverbs has already made clear and other places in Scripture do. Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger. Moms neither. But bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. There's those same two categories, formative and corrective. Okay, so in corrective discipline, I want to consider two aspects. We're going to do this from Psalm 23, just these two categories. This is not a perfect parallel, but I chose Psalm 23 because those of you who know Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me beside still waters into green pastures. For his name's sake, we feel the tender love of God. Even in it, Psalm 23 verse 4 says this: even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And how do I know that? Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Within corrective discipline, there is the rod and the staff. The rod is representative in Proverbs. It's 8 or 9 or 10 times. Always literally or figuratively, corporal punishment, corporal correction. Corporal comes from Latin corpus, meaning of the body. Corporal punishment, corporal discipline, is a short, temporary pain inflicted on the body to produce a later joy. Temporary pain physically to produce a later joy. And the Scriptures are not reticent to make known what God desires and what a child needs. Now, between the rod and the staff, remember, corrective discipline makes up, I'm saying in the book of Proverbs, about a third. I don't even know if that's entirely accurate. The one word is used 2/3, 1/3. Let's just say in the 1/3 that's corrective discipline, the majority of corrective discipline would be the staff. The rarer case would be the rod, would be corporal punishment. Again, hear all these things in the larger context. The rod first. Proverbs 13:24, whoever spares the rod hates his son. There are some of you who read that and are like, how can that even be in the Bible? Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. Fill in the phrase for me. Spare the rod. That's not actually in the Bible. It's a biblical concept. That's like a more popular phrasing of this proverb, because children need this. Whoever spares the rod hates his son. It is not loving to refuse to correct your kids. This is even the context of corporal discipline. Proverbs 23:13 and 14. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. If you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. Where our world tells you that corporal correction for a child, to slap their hand or to spank their bottom, where they tell you that will damage a child, that will make a child angry, that will make a child violent. What do you think you're modeling for a child? You're bigger, you're stronger, you're going to hit a child? What do you think that's going to teach them? That's not consistent with Scripture. Can you misuse that power? Have people misuse that power? Yes and yes. And this is in no way, shape, or form condoning any form of abuse against a child. Never is that acceptable. But because our world has a problem with appropriate physical discipline, doesn't mean we should forsake the godly and wise practice of it. Because folly is bound up in the hearts of our children. They need rescued. Who will be willing to rescue their children with loving, even corporal discipline? We must. Now, how do we make this practical? Oh man, who wants to step into that? Like, there's one thing that parents love: other parents telling them how to parent. Can I just get some agreement here that every single parent generally finds it obnoxious when some other parent is like, you should just do it the way that I do it. This is how it works. Like, okay, I get that. But if we don't at least make an attempt at making this practical, I'm not sure how much it serves us. So here's my humble attempt at making this practical. My thinking has been informed on this over the years by doctors Kevin Lehman, James Dobson, Ted Tripp. Probably most significantly, my own father. My own earthly father was a wonderful disciplinarian. I've probably learned more about disciplining and raising children from my own dad than I have had from anybody else. And that is a wonderful advantage. I lament those who were not well disciplined and didn't have it modeled. Seek counsel. Let people help you, because it's absolutely critical. Here's how I practiced it in a way that I think is wise. Now, I'm thinking first of a smack on the hand. I'm thinking of two kinds of corporal discipline: smack on the hand, smack on the butt. That's it. That's all I am talking about. Smack on the hand. Ballpark, Dr. Dobson and Kevin Lehman seem to say the same thing on this. When a child is about 18 months old, you begin to see in full form their miniature power to resist you, to reject you, to defy you. I think corporal discipline is reserved for the narrow experiences of obstinate refusal to obey. I'm not talking about every time a child disobeys. That would be a lot of corporal discipline. God doesn't seem to treat us that way. I'm talking about obstinate refusal to obey. When our kids were ballpark 18 months, I didn't write this down at the time. I could be off a few months. Ballpark 18 months. The progression was first, a stern look. Let's give them every opportunity to hear the still small voice before they get a bigger one. A stern look. Those of you parents that have practiced this, you can see sometimes a stern look is all it takes to get a child's attention. Child is erring. They are in error. Stern look. If they don't respond, stern look turns into stern voice. I don't normally speak to my children or anybody with a stern voice. That's why it's effective. If you're always shouting in your home, probably not going to get a whole lot of listening to a stern voice. Stern look, stern voice. They don't respond to either. Slap on the hand. When you slap the little chubby cherub's hand when they're 18 months old, what happens? Oh man, you get a response. Now, if you don't get a response, I would suggest you didn't do it hard enough. No discipline is pleasant at the time, but painful. It has to hurt. You're wasting your time if you just get it has to hurt. Never abuse. And there are some kids, I think, it's probably important to say, there are probably some children that should never receive corporal discipline. A child who is severely abused and then adopted, a child who has severe impairments physically, cognitively, I'm sure there are cases that it's not wise to even try corporal discipline. I am talking about in the vast majority of children that are healthy according to God's design. Stern look, stern voice, slap on the hand. You slap the chubby cherub's hand and they shriek. The first time I did this with my children, I felt terrible. What did I just do? They're so precious and now they're wailing. And then what did I discover? The wailing is very short-lived. And then the next time I give the stern look, there's a higher degree of likelihood that they're going to listen. Stern voice, they're remembering stern hand. I'm like, It's not foolproof, but it is a way to practically practice what God says is good and right. Who wants to talk about spanking? Nobody. Let's move on. But we must, as a child gets a little bit older, for refusal, obstinate refusal to obey. I have practiced with all 4 of my children spanking, and I have seen the fruits of it. I have not always done it well. I am not telling you do everything that I did. But I can say I believe the model that I received from my dad that I have practiced with my kids is worth emulating. Again, obstinate disobedience by parents. I don't think it's a good idea for other people to spank your kids. I've never given anybody permission to spank my children. Never, ever, ever. You as a parent may make a different decision. I would strongly caution you against that. It's from a parent, I think, for obstinate disobedience on the bottom, and that's it. A limited number of times, and it has to be painful. It has to be done in love, not just your anger. If you do not have self-control over your anger, and all you are doing is punishing this little child for making you angry, and you're taking it out on them, that is not what the Bible has in mind for corporal discipline. Maybe you need to walk away. Maybe you need to take a breath. Maybe you need to tap your spouse in, or maybe you just need to let this one ride with another painful consequence. You should not only spank a child in anger. At the same time, it's probably not realistic to think that you will never have to exercise self-control over your anger when you're spanking. If you had in mind you should never feel any anger in your heart when you're spanking a child, I'm not sure that that's possible or even right. Like, sin is grievous to God. Anger is a rightful response to injustice, but you have to control your anger when using corporal discipline. I would encourage you, clarity before, affirmation after. Clarity before, affirmation after. Clarity before looks like, do you know why I have to spank you right now? What do you think a kid says most of the time when you lead out with that question? I don't know. Let's try that again. Why do I need to spank you? 'Cause I fill in the blank. Yeah, but yes, that is wrong. But you absolutely refused to obey me. I told you not to do it, and you did it. We've talked about this before. Obstinate refusal. Clarity before. You understand why you're being spanked. I'm going to spank you X number of times. I think in our house, generally we practiced about 3. I mean, this is not an every week occurrence. It wasn't in our home. Generally 3. So, I'm going to spank you 3 times. Now, lay down over my lap. What percentage of time does child just say, okay, let's get this over with? Our kids were different. Some of our kids, it was so painful to even have to receive discipline, they just took it. Yep, I've done it. I deserve it. This is probably going to be good for me, Dad. Thank you. Okay, they never said that, but some were more readily to receive. Others, lay down over my lap. Nope, refusal. You didn't know a body could get so stiff. 2x6 rigid. Lay down over my lap. No. Okay, then I'm going to spank you 4 times. Did the child get angrier or calm down? Angrier. You have a choice right now. You can choose to obey me, and I will spank you 4 times. Or you can continue to refuse to obey, and we'll make it 5. Lay down over my lap. Refusal. 5. I don't recall having a child go above 5, but maybe there was a 6 in there somewhere. One of our children was particularly rigid in their approach. Clarity before. This is why this is happening. This is the number of times it's going to happen. And then you do it, and it has to hurt. I was taught by my dad to use your hand because it reminded you of the pain. So that's what I practiced. I used my hand. And that hurts. Physically, it should hurt. I don't know how to do it with my bare hand to hurt their bottom and not hurt my hand. Maybe it's because I'm a pastor and I send a lot of email. Maybe you work with your hands and you got bigger calluses. It was painful. I thought that was a good reminder. Afterwards, affirmation. My dad could write a book on this. My dad didn't do a great job proactively telling us kids how proud of us he was and how much he loved us, but he always did when he spanked us. Some of the most tender memories I have of my father are knowing his affirmation and his affection with his hand on my back, telling me why he loved me, what he was proud of me about. So we've practiced this with our kids. You're a wonderful young man, and I love you, and I'm proud of you for this reason, and this reason. I don't ever want to spank you again. I will, if I have to, but I don't want to. Clarity before, affirmation after, I think is a wonderful precedent and practice. That's the rod. Now the staff. This should be the majority of corrective discipline. By mere words, Proverbs 29:19 says, a servant is not disciplined, for though he understands, he will not respond. I wish speeches did all of the heavy lifting, but they don't. Sometimes, I think one of the biggest mistakes parents make is too much talking, not enough consequence. Just give them a consequence, get to it. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. Not only does a child that is undisciplined not get rescued by their parent from their folly, they become a thorn in the flesh of those around them, of their parents. There is many experiences of this. You probably all have situations in your mind. Okay, what does the staff look like? What are some principles for corrective discipline for your kids that isn't corporal punishment? The first is modeling. If you want your children to learn how to handle their error, well, then you have to model it. If you want your kids to learn self-control, you have to model it. If you want them to learn how to control their anger, you have to control yours. You have to model. And more specifically, with correction. You have to be consistent. I find this to be the greatest challenge. You have to be consistent. You're the parent. You set the boundaries. You set the rules. Pick your battles wisely. But you got to reinforce the boundaries. If you don't reinforce the boundaries, you're confusing a child. You're setting them up to respond to every authority the way that they respond to yours. It is not true that every authority is inconsistent. God is the opposite. If you are inconsistent as a parent, then you just model your child to think God is inconsistent. You have to be consistent. I found in my own home, my greatest challenge to being consistent looks like this. Ignore, ignore, ignore. Oh, now I'm irritated. Tolerate, tolerate, tolerate. You fill in the blank. Let's do that again. Ignore, ignore, ignore. Ooh, now you've irritated me. Tolerate, tolerate, tolerate. Yeah. I grew up in a house when that happened. I have made a house in which that happens. My children could all testify. Dad is so nice, so friendly. Then Dad gets fussy. And then you gotta be consistent. If you're not consistent, I know it's hard. You're tired. There's 100 other things you'd rather do. Who wants to be correcting their child? It's not enjoyable. Kids don't say, "Thank you so much, Daddy. This feels so good. I appreciate the correction. You're such a good dad. This is awesome." If they did that, I would be disciplining them as much as they needed it. It's hard work, but we need to be consistent, because if we're not, what are we modeling for a child? Not a big deal, not a big deal, not a big deal. Now it's becoming a medium deal. Why? Because you've irritated me. You've been inconvenient to me. It's me-centered. And then when I blow up, what have I made? All I've done for them is make my blow-up their problem instead of their behavior. It's my uncontrolled anger is the biggest problem. And then they're just going to duck and cover, let the storm blow over so they can get back to ignore, ignore, ignore. We have to be consistent. Responsibilities and privileges. In correcting a child where there isn't corporal discipline appropriate or necessary, I think responsibilities and privileges are highly valuable. We all have responsibilities. When we are faithful with our responsibilities, we get privileges. Jesus said, "The one who is faithful with little is entrusted with much." Jesus said, "The one to whom much is given, much is required." Children are absolutely incredible. They are smart, they are strong, they are resilient, they are capable. Give your children responsibility. Real responsibility appropriate for their age. They will grow up into it. And when they err, you correct them. And then it strengthens them and it reinforces to them, you are capable. I know you're capable. I'm not settling for less. I can call that out of you. I can grow that up in you. Responsibility gets privileges. We all have responsibilities. Moms, do you only cook dinner when you want to? Yeah, no, dads, moms, do you only go to work when you want to? So why is it okay if your kid says, "I don't want to clean up your room"? "I don't want to." Oh, okay, well, neither do I. It's your room, you're responsibility and privileges. You can withhold privileges. Kids, they want to decide what they want to do with their own time. That's a privilege to earn. If you don't do a good job with your choice making, with your responsibilities, I think it's a good idea to withhold privileges. When you do a good job with responsibility, give privileges. You are responsible, both for the things you're doing and saying and your error. So hold your children responsible for their error. Children should be raised knowing that it's normal to have to go to a sibling, to a parent, to a teacher, to a friend, and say, "I was wrong. Will you please forgive me?" The words matter. Will you please forgive me? Not just "I'm sorry," and the response is not just "it's okay." Will you please forgive me? Yes, I will forgive you. Those should be very normal words in a healthy house. Consequences. Reality is very often the best teacher. Sometimes a great challenge in parenting is to resist the temptation to shield your child from natural, painful consequences. Because we don't want our kids to be embarrassed. We don't like seeing our kids in pain. We don't want them to get bad grades. We don't want them to get cut from the sports team. We want them to make the school play. We want good things for them. We have a tendency to shield them from the painful consequences. The painful consequences are what's effective. One of our kids, when they were young, we were planning a birthday party for one of our kids. The kid went sideways. I forget. I was like 5 years old, I think. Just like out of their mind, sideways. Just not listening, not taking care of their responsibilities. And we told this particular child, you will lose your birthday party. What kind of parent takes away a birthday party? It was my wife. I was like, honey, that's too much. Hillary was like, I'm canceling this stupid party. No, that's not true. We told the child, you will lose your birthday party. Child tested the boundary, crossed the boundary. What's the right thing to do? Your party's canceled, sorry. Goes berserk and freaks out. Well, who's responsible for that? You are, child. These are the consequences of your actions. It would not, in that case, have been loving or gracious to give her the birthday party. Oh, I said her. That narrows it down to 2. Name begins with a D. There have to be consequences. Don't shield your kids from the natural consequences that are painful. All right, let's end with a couple of verses that make a direct connection to Jesus. Hebrews 12:10, for they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them, referring to our parents. But God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. Do you know that you have never received discipline from God that was not perfectly chosen? It was exactly as severe as it needed to be. It was exactly the right duration. The consequences aligned perfectly with the seriousness of your error. And it was perfectly effective. All of us as parents have made bonehead decisions with discipline. But sometimes you get it right. And you're like, ooh, that was good. I mean, I hope you've experienced this in your family. You say to your husband, your wife, oh, wow, that went really good. That was like perfect. God's always perfect. Proverbs 20, verse 30, blows that wound cleanse away evil. It's true of our kids. Strokes make clean the innermost parts. Most true in Jesus, who was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. God's corrective discipline is loving. It's an evidence of love. It's an act of love. A parent should discipline their kids out of the same commitment to act in their highest good. It's a rescue mission. A rescue mission that is modeled after what God, the greatest Father of all, has done for all who would listen and receive and respond to his correction, paying for the debt of their sin with the blood of his own Son. Let me pray for us.